Dr. Phil has been unleashed.
Welcome to my channel, Outspoken Samantha. If you are new here, welcome. I would really appreciate your help in growing this channel, and I invite you to subscribe. And if you are returning, I truly appreciate your continued support on my channel, and it would help me out a lot if you would make sure that you are subscribed as well. So we need to talk about this man right here. So with how left-leaning pretty much every single mainstream media outlet has become and every single streaming service, I, like most of you, have pretty much given up on every single one of these platforms. There's no neutrality left on any of them. And they're all pretty much required, at least if they want their content to reach anyone, to pledge their allegiance to the trending leftist narrative of the day, and or to accept or praise whatever abhorrent behavior they're trying to normalize under the guise of inclusivity, or they risk having their program completely shoved to the bottom of the list so that no one finds it, or just have it completely canceled altogether. And not to mention the inevitable targeting that they will face from the woke mob in the form of threats, harassment, or being swatted, or any number of other intimidation tactics. That being said, it is always refreshing when we finally get someone who breaks away from the mind-melting nonsense of the left and points out the utter insanity. And of course, the person I'm talking about today who has decided to finally start calling out the insanity for what it is none other than Dr. Phil McGraw. And this is huge because this man has a massive, massive audience. He's worth almost $500 million. And not only that, he's just a big man, like physically. Seriously, this man is huge. So with his decades of experience in dealing with tough issues and talking with people who have some serious, serious mental health problems or other kind of conflicts going on in their lives, and repeatedly putting himself in very uncomfortable situations in dealing with these issues, let's just say he is not going to be intimidated from facing these challenges head on, and he is not going to be intimidated by the mentally ill woke mob that will inevitably try to come after him. And yes, I do understand that he is a TV show host, and sometimes his shows are like one step above Jerry Springer, and there's a lot of sensationalizing of these situations for the sake of making it entertaining television.
Catch me outside, how about that?
And I know there are a lot of people that have different opinions on whether or not they actually think he's a psychologist, and that is totally fine, but let's not get distracted, because what I want to focus on here and what I think is truly important is the fact that he is shining light on the real issues that are causing so many problems in society today, and I can truly appreciate him for doing that. So the first thing that caught my attention was when a couple of months ago, Dr. Phil talked about the rampant anti-Semitism that is happening in today's universities. He did share a video on his own channel where he heavily criticized the university presidents who were questioned during the Senate hearings about this rampant anti-Semitism and the protests and the violence that was happening. And he truly had a lot to say about the disgraced faux scholar Claudine Gay of Harvard and Liz McGill of the University of Pennsylvania, where when they were asked about whether or not calling for the genocide of Jewish people and the nation of Israel, which is exactly what these large mobs were doing, if those things violate the policies of bullying and harassment. And when asked that question, every single one of them answered, well, it depends on the context. And conveniently, in that moment, they were all suddenly very in favor of the First Amendment. So I will post the video that he shared on his channel in the description box below. But around the same time, he did an interview with Sean Hannity to discuss this situation. And this is some of what he had to say.
Here you're talking about genocide of Jews. And then, of course, we want to back off. But we apply one standard to different identity groups, but not to the Jewish people. Why? At Harvard and these other schools.
Sean, it's really disgusting, and it's so hypocritical to hear Harvard talking about, well, it's free speech. They wouldn't know free speech if it came up and bit them in the ass. They don't do free speech, they do their speech. You know, genocide's an interesting term. It doesn't sound real bad if you say it real fast, but the definition of it is to kill a large number of an ethnic group with the purpose of wiping them off the face of the earth and destroying their nation. And that's what we're talking about here. But there are even exceptions to free speech. I'm not a lawyer. I don't mean to brag, but I'm not. But there are exceptions to free speech. You cannot incite people to violence, which they're doing. You cannot target someone with specific threats, which they're doing. But still, we're not talking about speech here. We're talking about actions. They're blocking, impeding people's path to their classes. They're going in and disrupting their classes, going into the library and intimidating these students. And they're saying, oh, well, that just doesn't violate our policies. That's insane.
So I think not a lot of commentary here is needed. This is pretty self-explanatory. We have all seen these massive protests on college campuses and the students being targeted. Jewish students begging for protection, pleading with professors and administrators to stop this behavior because they do not feel safe on campuses. And we have seen numerous hearings of these particular students showing up and saying, this is the stuff that I am experiencing. I don't feel safe even walking on college campus. Yet for some reason, this doesn't qualify as bullying and harassment. For some reason, it doesn't qualify as using words to incite violence, which is the entire premise for every single J6 defendant that is sitting and rotting in jail right now. Supposedly, somebody else's violent words caused them to behave in a violent way. And we had a Cornell University professor talking about how alive the violence against Jewish people in Israel made him feel. And we did see the video footage of those students barricading the library door while standing in the hall screaming at the Jewish students inside. And the incidents have been countless over the last few months. So this is not just a matter of verbal threats. This is a matter of actual physical harm and violence. And if that doesn't meet the threshold of bullying and harassment and beyond, I don't know what does. And then he goes on to talk about what is happening in the lower grades of public education.
Over 30% of our fifth graders and eighth graders cannot read at the most basic level. 19% of our high school graduates can't read. They're getting passed so the schools can get paid. And yet they're wanting to talk about other things. And that is completely absurd. And what's happening here, and it's happening from the primary grades up through college, is you're right. They're running their own woke agendas. And that is absolutely unacceptable. And these people that are counseling these students on these issues, whether they're psychological or medical, don't have training in psychology. They don't have training in medicine. They don't have training in sociology. So they're not trained in any of the disciplines that would qualify them to counsel these students on these issues, and they're excluding the parents. They've known these kids sometimes for 2 or 3 weeks, and they exclude the parents completely. And they don't have the training to do this. They need to stick to what they're trained to do. And most of the teachers, Sean, would prefer to do that. This is getting jammed down their throats just like it is everybody else. The teachers are not the problem. It's the policymakers and the teachers' unions that are creating the problem.
So I can appreciate everything that he is saying there, and we will get more into what the last part of what he was talking about in just a minute. Usually when we see someone who is well known in the media or in Hollywood or in any kind of that aspect, when they take a stand on something, it's usually a one-off thing, because what ends up happening is they are either intimidated into publicly apologizing for speaking out, or they speak out on one thing and then they ignore the rest of the dumpster fires that are happening in every aspect of American life because the backlash of the mob is just too much to deal with. But thankfully, as I said, Dr. Phil is not an easily intimidated person, and he did not just stop there. Unlike our President of the United States and his incredibly intelligent vice president, Dr. Phil actually decided to take a trip to the southern border with the interest of actually seeing the reality of what is happening there. He wanted to find out, are us conservative conspiracy theorists making a big deal because we're trying to make the current president look bad, or are Democrats diminishing the severity of the issue to try and make the current president look good? Because they really have their work cut out for them in that area. But if it's the latter, what are the consequences of misleading people on what the southern border actually looks like? So the first clip that came to light of this trip to the border was him standing at the border, getting ready to share a report on the issue. You can hear him talking about the fentanyl issue and some of the info that he has been given from Homeland Security. So the question is the amount of fentanyl coming over the border pretty standard for what we've dealt with in the past? Because drug smuggling is something that has always been an issue at the border. Or are we really experiencing unprecedented levels of these deadly drugs coming across the border because of failed border policies over the last few years? And is the amount coming over the border enough to kill every single person in America? Probably more than once.
Enforcement has seized over 454 million lethal doses of fentanyl during this border mission. According to the Department of Homeland Security, since President Biden took office, more than 6 million illegal immigrants have crossed Texas' southern border in just 3 years. That's more than the population of 33 different states in this country. And what about our Vice President, Kamala Harris? Did you know she's our country's immigration czar? Guess how many times she's been to the border? One.
So I know that audio is a little bit difficult to hear, but he did say that Texas law enforcement has seized over 450 million lethal doses of fentanyl, and there have been 6 million crossings over the last 3 years since Biden took office. And he pointed out, he said, did you know that Kamala Harris is the immigration border czar? Did you know that? Because I don't think a lot of people knew that. She was assigned that task about 3 months into being elected or selected as the vice president, yet she has only been to the border one time. So let's have a look at a little bit more of what he had to say during this interview.
One of the most psychological principles, one of the most fundamental psychological principles is you don't reward bad behavior. And I wanted to go talk to the guys that are heading this up. And I have to tell you,
I just wanted to, I'm sorry, I know that was really quick. I wanted to touch on that point really quick when he says don't reward bad behavior, because he's talking about all of these incentives that these people know are available to them if they come to our border, and the fact that they're not going to be stopped, that they're going to make it somewhere in the country, and they're just going to be able to get lost and not face any consequences for it. But when it comes to not rewarding bad behavior, that's pretty much all the Democrat Party does these days. They either ignore the bad behavior as long as whoever is carrying it out aligns with them or creates a situation that is going to further a particular narrative and that allows that person to keep inflicting harm on others, or they celebrate the bad behavior so that this person can continue to inflict harm on others.
Impressive troops down there. These guys are fighting a morale battle because they can't get what they need. And I wanted to know what's happening down here. What's really going on? You know, we hear this number, 6 million people have come across under the current administration. I talked to experts down there that say that number is a myth, that it's closer to 13 to 14 million that have come across. And I asked them straight up, what is it you need here? And I was shocked to hear them say, we don't need more money. We don't need more resources. We don't need more officers. We don't need more legislation. We just need the laws that are on the books to be followed. We need to be allowed to do our job, and we can get this under control right now. We don't need a bunch more money, officers, and legislation. Just let us do our job. That's all we need. And if you'll do that, we can get this under control overnight.
Which is also another really interesting point, because the Democrats were recently hyperventilating about, I believe it was called the Border Protection Act, I'm not entirely sure, but hyperventilating about that bill being passed, insisting that there was all of this money that was going to be sent to the border to supposedly solve this problem, and accusing Republicans of not caring about the border because they opposed this bill and all of the spending that came with it. In reality, they are using the border crisis to their advantage as a cover for things like this bill, where they can just justify more spending. But this bill in particular was really about sending more money overseas to Ukraine for a war that we're not even sure is happening right now. But the agents at the border who deal with this situation every minute of every day are telling these legislators to stop using our name as a means to get more money, because we don't need it. We just need to be able to enforce the laws that are already in place and stop attacking us and penalizing us when we do. So this means that any bill that is proposed under the guise of the border needs more money is absolute BS. And it also means that the Biden administration is keeping these agents from being able to manage the border in a way that would actually stop this from happening so that they can use this crisis to get more money, which is also just BS. I mean, most of you probably knew that already, but if you didn't know that, now you do. And if you don't believe it by now, then I'm sure your pronouns are sie, them, zer, and you're someone who believes BS. And the last issue that Dr. Phil has been particularly vocal about is this gender craze that has gotten so out of control. And I mean, honestly, was it ever in control? Because these ideas are completely insane and predatory and devastating. But he did sit down with Joe Rogan to discuss the reality of what is happening. The clip that is going around is about 9 minutes long. And if you want to see the whole thing, I do highly recommend it. And I'll link it in the description box. But I pulled just a couple of important points that he talks about, because he addresses some of the most common arguments that we hear that, that people use to convince themselves that allowing children to mutilate their bodies is safe, life-saving, and or necessary for them to be their true selves.
It's interesting they choose words like gender-affirming care. That's interesting that they call it that, but really what they're talking about is hormonal therapy or sex reassignment surgery.
Sorry, I just had to stop it right there real quick because I love how he emphasized the word call it that, meaning he knows that the labels that these people use are entirely and intentionally misleading because it doesn't accurately describe what it is that these kids are going to be dealing with and what these surgeries and treatments actually look like, but it takes something horrific and it makes it sound nice and fluffy.
On children. And in fairness, the American Medical Association, the American Academy of Pediatrics, the American Endocrine Society, or whatever the exact name of that is, all of the major medical associations have signed off on this, Joe. They've signed off on it. And I have never seen those organizations sign off on anything with less information as to whether or not it does long-term harm of anything in my life. And when I ask about that, when I bring that up, then they immediately label you as transphobic.
Welcome to being a conservative. Using the word transphobic is just another huge red flag when it comes to this issue, because you can't talk about the lack of long-term information and studies that say that this stuff is not actually helping people's lives or improving their mental health or reducing suicidality rates or anything like that. And you can't bring it up without being called names. And that is just absolutely bonkers and just shows how truly insane this whole thing is. But there's a reason that we have clinical trials and studies of things to make sure that what we're prescribing is actually safe and beneficial. But this is one area where for some reason we can't seem to do that because they mainstreamed this treatment, making every single one of these patients the actual study. And then they'll compile the data in 20 years when we have thousands of young people whose bodies were unnecessarily mutilated and sterilized.
And I thought that the deal was first do no harm. And all of the European countries, Sweden, Norway, they've all stopped doing it because they say, we cannot say in good conscience that this does no harm.
And just real quick, yes, there have been so many studies done in European countries, and the data that they are finding actually cause them to put an immediate stop to these operations, stop to this ideology, majorly scaling it back, shut down, turn off the lights, everybody go home and find a new job. So if the information that they're gathering didn't just tell them to slow down, but to quit doing this pretty much altogether, that and the fact that the US is actually ignoring those studies tells us how truly evil and ludicrous this whole thing is.
And they're telling me that they have a duty to the children, that if the child is not ready to talk to their parents about this, that it's okay for them to keep a secret from the child. Now, first off, if this is either a psychological phenomenon or a medical phenomenon. and the teachers are not trained in either psychology or medicine. They're not any more trained to deal with that than they are to take out the kid's spleen in the homeroom. Secondly, it's teaching the child to keep a secret from their parents. It's teaching deception and interfering between the child's relationship with their parent. Now, their issue with their justification for that is, well, if the child goes home and announces this, or if we tell it to the parent, then the child could get abused, the child could get judged, the child could get kicked to the curb. But they have to admit, statistically, that is very rare. And if that's the case, that's what we have Department of Child and Family Services for. That's what we have Child Protective Services for. If that's the case, then you call in for some intervention if the child is being abused at home for whatever reason.
Thank you. So the argument is that the kid may not feel ready to tell the parents, or that it's an uncomfortable subject, so they don't want to bring it up, or whatever the situation is. And that argument just blows my mind, because you know what else my child is really uncomfortable telling me about? If they get in trouble at school, or if they get a bad grade on an assignment or in a class. And it's not because they think that I'm going to beat them, it's just they have made a poor decision, and that's always a difficult thing to bring to the attention of their parent. Yet somehow, I get a phone call the same day from their teacher or the school counselor or the principal, or sometimes all three, if something happens. Because in those scenarios, the teachers seem to recognize that the parents need that information in order to help address the problem. They recognize that the parent actually loves their child and doesn't want them to get in trouble at school, doesn't want them to fail their grades, doesn't want to do poorly on their homework or have a rough time at school in any way. And they recognize that if a child gets into an altercation or something happens, that it is crucial to tell the parent so that they can help correct the problem, address it at home with their kid, and figure out how to make the situation better and hopefully to avoid it in the future. Because they know that that parent is going to get their child the help that they need, whether it be medical assistance, whether it be mental health assistance, whether it be a tutor, whether it be extra time on a particular subject, or if it's just that parent having a discussion with them about what lessons can be learned from this situation and how to have a better approach to it in the future. Whatever the situation is, parents want the best for their kids regardless of what it is, and it is a completely false narrative that this is the one issue that they can't bring up to their parents. For one thing, the teacher is not the parent and cannot be the parent. They have dozens and sometimes hundreds of students, depending on the school and the grade level, and it is impossible for them to parent every single child, and they know it is not their job. And any teacher who says otherwise is lying and should be fired, because that's not a teacher, that is a predator. I mean, can you imagine if a child got a bad grade on something and the teacher says, you can't tell your parents, they'll be angry, they're not going to love you anymore, they're not going to understand. Is that child going to improve their grades with that approach? Is that child likely to get the help that they need to improve the situation? No, and that would be insane. So to say that any of this is to actually help the child makes absolutely no sense. And again, it's because it is total and utter crap. Because they want every kid to be taught this destructive ideology without their parents getting in the way, so that they can create a future society of crippled, incapable, mentally ill individuals who cannot contribute anything productive to society or have healthy families or raise strong kids of their own. After I finished recording my first video, Dr. Phil made an appearance on The View and attempted to educate the hags of this show on the COVID lockdowns and the devastating impact that they had on children, and that information was about as well received by these women as any information is ever received, but it's at least worth including.
And then COVID hits 10 years later, and the same agencies that knew that are the agencies that shut down the schools for 2 years. Who does that? Who takes away the support system for these children? Who takes them away and shuts it down? And by the way, when they shut it down, they stopped the mandated reporters from being able to see children that were being abused and sexually molested, and in fact sent them home and abandoned them to their abusers with no way to watch, and referrals dropped 50 to 60%. So
there was also a pandemic going on, and they were trying to save
kids' lives. Remember, we know a lot of folks who died during this. So it wasn't, people weren't laying around eating bond, but, well, you know what? We're lucky. Maybe we're lucky they didn't, because we kept them out of the the places that they could be sick because no one wanted to believe we had an issue.
Are you saying no school children died of COVID?
I'm saying it was the safest group. They were the less vulnerable group, and they suffered and will suffer more from the mismanagement of COVID than they will from the exposure to COVID. And that's not an opinion, that's a fact.
Well, Phil?
It just goes to show how truly interested these women are in just the narrative and not the facts and information. And they are definitely not interested in protecting children. Dr. Phil did not say that no children died from this virus. He pointed out the fact that we know and that we knew pretty early on that this group was not vulnerable to this virus. That yes, they would get sick, but for the most part, such a small percentage of them were actually dying from it, that it was far more safer for them to be in school with people that could protect them and report abuse to the proper authorities versus the actual harm of being isolated with their abusers in their homes. But Whoopi's message to them, to these kids that were in their home with their abusers on a daily basis with no one to talk to, is that they are just lucky to be alive and that they should be grateful that they did not have to face a virus, even though they had to sit at home with no one to talk to and no one to save them from the actual harm and devastation that they were dealing with on a daily basis. And then they have the audacity to ask a stupid question like, are you saying that no kids died from COVID? Essentially attempting to try to paint Dr. Phil as some kind of COVID denier and attempt to discredit this information that is actually important for people to hear. Anyway, like I said, I am so grateful for Dr. Phil speaking out on these things, regardless of what your opinion of him is, regardless of what your opinion of Sean Hannity is. None of that it really matters, and all of that is a distraction. And it's really funny because as he was posting things on his own pages about these interviews, I saw some of the comments. And, there were people calling him a traitor and calling him brainwashed for even being willing to talk to Sean Hannity, which is beyond ironic because it takes a brainwashed person to think that having a conversation with someone you disagree with is a bad, harmful, phobic thing. So maybe just look in the mirror a little bit next time you throw those insults at people. So I would love to hear all the thoughts in the comments below, but if you could hit that like button and make sure that you are subscribed, those are two very simple things that you can do that really help me out. I appreciate you all so much. Keep it real, guys, and I will see you in the next one.